Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
Recently, the country saw heated debates about the three-language formula policy. The idea was students would learn three languages, one regional language which could be their mother tongue, another modern Indian language like Hindi in states that don't already speak Hindi, and English. It led to a furor as some politicians saw it as being imposition of Hindi by the backdoor. But recently, while visiting an art installation in a Santhal village in Bengal, I was reminded that it isn't just about Hindi or English pushing other languages around. Languages that bristle at the dominance of, say, Hindi might themselves be overwhelming other languages in their neighborhood. The art exhibit by Mithu Sen at the Bengal Biennale was all about reminding Santhali speakers of their own script by painting the letters and numbers on the walls of houses, script that many of them have forgotten because they write in Devanagari instead. While we argue about three languages, what about the other 777? That's because the People's Linguistic Survey of India estimated there were at least 780 languages in India in 2010. Many of them were endangered, some down to the last handful of speakers. Today on the show, we talk about India's linguistic diversity with two experts who have spent their lives devoted to that very issue. Ganesh Devy is a cultural activist and literary critic who started the Bhasha Research and Publication Center in Baroda and the Adivasi Academy, and was the editor of the People's Linguistic Survey of India, which was conducted in 2010 and published in 50 volumes. We reached him in Baroda. Anvita Abbi is a linguist and scholar of minority and tribal languages all over the country, but best known for her work on the languages and cultures of the Great Andamanese. She put together voices from the Lost Horizon, stories and songs of the Great Andamanese. We reached her in New Delhi. Ganesh Devy and Anvita Abbi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to join you on this today.
Thanks for having me in this conversation.
Sure. Ganesh Devy, I read that India is in the top 5 countries with maximum number of languages, others being like Nigeria, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea. First off, what accounts for such a diversity of languages in India?
Well, I think it will be good to drop the terminology of top and bottom. Human settlements on the surface of the earth have had various histories, particularly migration histories, and where there has been a great amount of migration for the last 70,000 years. In those areas, there are more languages. Where the migrations have been relatively fewer, there have been fewer languages. It is the South Asian history which saw migrations first from Africa, then from Central Asia, Iran, West Asia, then from Central Asia, then from Europe, East Asia. And that's why we have more languages.
I see.
It is the same case with other countries such as Indonesia or Nigeria. So languages are brought in by migrations. They grow through interactions with other languages. They decline when people start migrating out of an area, out of a language zone. It's a melting pot, constantly mixing, merging, and also becoming separate. They are not like a pool of animals. Languages are not an organic system. They are a cultural, symbolic system, social system.
And one of the areas that you studied, Anvita Abbi, is in the Andamans. When we look at the languages there, what do they tell us about the migration that Ganesh Devy was talking about?
Ganesh did talk about that the first migration came from Africa, and Great Andamanese are the remnants of the very first migration that took place 70,000 years ago from Africa. And maybe by the time they came to settle themselves in the Andaman, that must be 60,000 years ago, because it takes a while to cross the land. At that time, the sea level was very low, so they walked. They had no ship, no boats, no any other navigation facilities. So these were the very first migration. And since the Great Andamanese, according to the geneticists, lived in isolation all their lives till in the 19th century, when the Britishers came there and made it a penal colony, late 18th century actually, in 1968, that they came in contact with the Great Andamanese. And that was the very first contact they had with the outsiders. Till then, they warded off their land, even from the locals like Jarvas or Onges, and they had almost no contact. So the language has retained some of its archaic structures. And of course, there are internal innovations if the languages does not come into contact with other languages. So there were many internal innovation in this language family also. I call it a family because there were 10 languages once upon a time. But by the time I reached there were only remains of 4 languages.
And when you talk about the remnants, are we able to find connections in those remnants with languages still spoken in Africa from where these people, their ancestors had come?
I've asked this question several times, but Sandip, you see, the languages of Africa have evolved in the last 70,000 years, so much so, coming internally and externally, that they are beyond recognition with the Great Andamanese language, because they have retained some of its archaic structures. And those archaic structures I could unearth in the grammar. And that's where the skeleton of the body is, where flesh decays and skeleton remains much longer. So there are aspects of grammar which are very, very unique.
Like what?
They have a way of prefixing every part of speech. Noun, verb, adjectives, adverbs, you just name it. Every part of speech with one of the 7 prefixes, which are nothing but some monosyllables which emote 7 divisions of body. So external body parts are emoted by air. And if somebody is beautiful, adjective, that is also emoted by, you have to put a prefix air. But if somebody is beautiful inside, like a nice person, then you have to prefix a body part, body division, not body part, because each body division has several parts in them. So that body division, which is reserved for internal body parts like liver, spleen, you can't see those. So it is A. So somebody become A beautiful or air beautiful depending upon what you're describing.
Oh, whether they're beautiful inside or whether their face is beautiful.
Yeah. Similarly, the name for blood is, for us, just blood is blood. But for them, it all depends where the blood is coming from. So the blood coming from the forehead is air tei. If it is coming from the inside, like internal bleeding, if you have, then it is a tei. If it is coming from the fingers, then it is ong tei, and so on and so forth. So that's very amazing.
Ganesh, Devy, when the People's Linguistic Survey of India, was trying to count the languages spoken in India and the state of this, what were some of the other examples you found where, as Anvita Abbi was saying, you got to see a really unique worldview of a people through their language?
Well, every language is a unique worldview, because language is not just words and grammar, but it is a concept, a conception, an idea of what space is and what time is. And everything which happens in that language has implicit in it. So each of the languages has a worldview. But as far as the People's Linguistic Survey of India was concerned, the aim was not to count the languages, how many there are. I mean, that kind of curiosity is, of course, a popular curiosity, and I am no exception. But there was another curiosity, and that is to see if the technical divide between what is a language and what is a dialect can be tested against available data in the country. Because when Grierson had done his survey,
this is during colonial times,
he had about 179 languages and 554 dialects. So we were interested in checking if some of those which were marked as dialects were in fact languages. I mean, let me say why I had that question in my mind. When William Jones spoke about Indo-European, there is a very graphic geographical discussion in the comments in that third anniversary address of William Jones, where he talks of a landmass stretching all the way from deep in Russia to, say, Iran or Iraq, Armenia in the west, and from Europe, from all the way down to East Asia. So implicit in that was a dream of a large empire. But as linguistics progress all through the 19th century and the 20th century, linguists have become acutely aware that there is need to decide of language association in terms of small language families. And so in the Jones's times, there was thinking only about a few language families. Now we have a large number of language families emerging. And that's where Anvita Abbi's work is very important in showing a new direction to the entire approach to the language talk of human beings. Now, to your question, what unique things I saw in every language has a unique worldview, but in particular, the color terms in Indian languages are so many. Unfortunately, after the development of synthetic colors developed by Perkin at the Leeds laboratory in 1887, humans have stopped looking at colors the way they are, and therefore a lot of color terms have started disappearing from many languages. But there are still in existence hundreds of color terms in different languages, and many of them are unique to those particular languages. I mean, think of Gondi, which has a much richer set of color terms than the Hindi language has, for instance.
Ganesh, when I said that Great Andamanese is a unique language, I was trying to explicate that the grammar is unique. It does not have any similarity with any of the other language families that exist in the world. And that's something, because that's something to be taken recognition of, that India has this kind of a heritage. Of course, every language has a unique worldview because we emote our worldview through different means. That's why linguistics and linguists are interested in unearthing more and more languages. So grammar is unique because this kind of body division markers are never been ever identified with any language or any language family. The second thing that dialect and language question, I know we have discussed this earlier among ourselves, is so politicized that it is very difficult to distinguish between what is a dialect and what is a language. Sometimes a language, after years of being spoken, becomes a dialect. And that is true for Braj Bhasha. What was Braj Bhasha once upon a time, now it has become a dialect of Hindi, and Hindi was a khadi boli. The name itself said boli, and it has become a bhasha. So tables have turned upside down because of the politics into it. And this happens in many other ways also. When you were collecting your data on PLS, I remember I told you that there are several languages which have been identified as dialects by some people, and several dialects have been identified as language.
So in that case, Anvita, and I'll put this to both of you, is it sort of pointless to, try and decide what is language, what is dialect? I think, Ganesh Devy, in the People's Linguistic Survey of India, did you sort of leave it up to the speaker to decide if this was their language or not?
We decided to respect people's sentiment because it was survey of the language situation in India on a given date, like 2010, 2011, and where people felt that it was what they had was a language and not dialect of another language. We accepted their claim. This is to say that if linguists sit down and verify if that's a dialect or a language, the results, the outcome may be somewhat different. And our reason was the government was not doing a survey. Therefore, people decided to do it. And obviously, when people decide to do it, it had to be done from people's perspective rather than from a structural or a perspective of some authority.
And as a result of that survey, if I remember reading the reports right, you identified some 780 languages in 2010.
I will modify that sentence a little bit. I did not identify 780 language groups, speech communities came forward to claim that they had their own language. Languages were alive, people were speaking. They came forward to claim that they had, and those claims were accepted.
Were the people deciding whether a language was endangered or not? What were the parameters?
Well, endangered language is a different affair. I mean, and Anvita will be far better commentator on that. But let me say that this vocabulary of endangerment came to us after UNESCO set an alarm on languages. But the UNESCO parameters of endangerment are, in many cases, are rather quantitative rather than qualitative, like how much endangered, is it 80% endangered, or what are the parameters? Is it spoken by less than 10,000 or 1,000 or something like that? And those parameters don't apply to all languages in the world equally well. But endangerment of a different kind I noticed, and that is people were being pushed out of their own language zones due to economic reasons, and therefore they were willing to abandon their language. Or larger languages were trying to impose them on smaller languages after the creation of linguistic states. I mean, for instance, in Maharashtra, Marathi became the language of imposition, in Gujarat, Gujarati, and in Madhya Pradesh, Hindi. And in the process, the entire group of Bhili speakers got divided between Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, turning into minority, therefore creating a potential endangerment of their language heritage.
Sandeep, there are several issues actually. Endangerment is the word which became very vogue in mid-90s. And I had started working on so-called marginalized languages and lesser-known languages already in 70s. So, I started being recognized that this lady works on endangered languages, but actually I've been working on these marginalized languages, which are considered, many of them are endangered. And as Ganesh says, that it is true, he actually collected what people think about it. And that's why there are so many mismatches with the real language names. As far as the UNESCO is concerned, Sandeep, we have two indices in linguistics or in the world to measure the vitality of a language. So there are vitality indices. One is proposed by UNESCO and other is proposed by Ethnologue. Their scales are different and their results don't match. The third indice is the census, which is homegrown. So that also doesn't match with the UNESCO or with the Ethnologue. So people are totally confused if you match these three indices, and each has its own way of measuring it. Right now, I'm one of the expert member of the UNESCO's World Atlas of Languages. And we have frequently meeting. We just had a concluded meeting in Paris, and I spoke very much against their parameters because I find that the UNESCO way of measuring the language vitality is very Eurocentric. They give too much importance on the written aspect of language. They give too much importance about whether the teaching materials are available in this language, then this language is robust. If not, then this language is endangered. I told them and I showed them that India has more than 700 unwritten spoken languages which are still thriving because of strong oral tradition. And for the first time now, because of my being there, the now oral, if you will see the new UNESCO report or the UNESCO questionnaire, which is filled by the focal points all over the world, you will see there are new questions because oral tradition is now included in all its genres. The other things that they have included is that there are many communities whose languages are not at all accounted for. For example, nomadic communities, sex workers. They have a different language, but nobody mentions. Another criteria of UNESCO's, which is very problematic for me, is intergenerational transfer. In Northeast, there are languages like Karbi. People are learning it. Census has shown that there's an increase in Karbi, not because it is a home language, but other people are learning it. You see? So there are many contact languages in the Northeast which have evolved because not of intergenerational transfer. So how do you account for that? So the South Asia is a very different picture, which the UNESCO must account for, that we have very different ways of retaining our languages. Despite of homogenization, despite of industrialization, despite of all kinds of imposition that the government of India does in the form of education, they have still survived. And the key point is, and the key reason is because they are spoken at home.
Sometimes I wonder whether a language might be spoken at home and I might say I speak that language, but is there another kind of cultural loss happening because I don't actually read very much in that language anymore if there is a script available, or it has not, or my language of sort of professional use has become Hindi and English.
Yeah, I know this kind of status symbol is there, that if your language doesn't have a written script, or if your language is not taught in school, it's no longer a language, it's a dialect. But this is why I'm not very happy with this language dialect question. I always treat every speech community speaking, if there is a speech, then it is a language, because it has all the aspects scientifically that a language should have. Yes, the language, if it increases its domain of use, as you just mentioned, if it is used in education, if it is used in communication, written communication, if it is used on internet, in various other ways of putting a poster in or whatever, then language will definitely increase, its status. But the problem is that our languages, most of the, as I just mentioned, Sandip, you should not disregard our oral tradition. And oral tradition, when I say, it has many genres, folklore is one of them. Indigenous knowledge that Ganesh just talked about, the color terms that are retained in our indigenous languages. Santali has 10 different words just for burning. Hair burning, leaf burning, paper burning, even corpse burning or any other thing burning has different word for smell. Great Andamanese, I collected 18 different words for smell alone. They have 6 different words for seashores, and it's never written down.
What are the 6 differences in seashores? We who live so far from it don't even...
I had to live there and see it, because when the tide comes, the kind of seashore you get is a very different from the seashore that you get when the sea is calm. But when the sea recedes, you see lots of rocks underneath, and there's lot of biological, whole bio world existing. And they collect the crabs, they collect the shells, they collect all kinds of things. It's the part of their life, you see. That seashore becomes part of their life. Similarly, they have 6 different opening of forest. For me, when I see an open forest, for me, there's one word in Hindi, ki khula jungle hai. But it's not that, So it was so fascinating and educating for me that why people think that this language does not have knowledge. It has all the knowledge. Why do you think, Sandeep, all the Andamanis saved themselves in tsunami? Neither a single person died in Jarwa, nor in Onge, nor in Great Andamanese. And India lost 7,000 people. People who died were people like you and me, you see, because we had no knowledge. While these Great Andamanese had the knowledge of visualizing the sea waves and detecting the danger coming. So Jarwa had a word for it. Great Andamanese had a word for it. Onge had a word for it. And they, because if you remember, tsunami came early morning at 6 o'clock or 5:30. They were all fishing by the side of the sea. Each of them spoke those words and people ran into the forest or wherever they could find their space to go up, and they saved themselves. Andamanis were on the tree for 3 days and 3 nights till a help came to them, because there were no hillock in that straight island where they live. So, I was wondering, I said they had the great knowledge of saving themselves. I mean, disaster management. If you have to learn, you learn from these tribals. They have coexisted on this earth for thousands and thousands of years.
Sandipji, on the question of what Anvita says about the importance of oral in the life of a language is of great significance. I mean, you think of Sanskrit when we're talking of indigenous languages of tribals, but think of Sanskrit. First known composition belongs to 1400 before Christ. And soon after that, scripts were available in the other parts of the world. There's Hittite script, Aramaic, there's Chinese developed scripts. Soon after, Greek was heading towards developing his own script. Sanskrit refused to be written for the next 1200 years. The entire language tradition, and it was becoming a language of knowledge. It was during the Ashoka's times that first writing starts in India. And the earliest inscriptions, Ashokan inscriptions, were not in Sanskrit at all. They were in Greek, the Aramaic, they're in the Dravidian.
Old Tamil also, yes.
Tamil, all and any number of scripts are used. The first Sanskrit inscription belongs to the 1st century before Christ. That's for 1300 years. A language remains in oral tradition. keeps growing in prestige. It keeps growing as a language of knowledge. If our linguistic heritage has these examples, and similar with Tamil, for several centuries, this from 7th century before Christ to the 3rd century before Christ, Tamil is outside writing, but poetry was growing. It is the case with every Indian language, even the Prakruts. Buddha's teachings were not written immediately after Buddha died. It took 3 centuries, and then they were Buddha or Mahavir Jain. For 3 centuries, they waited for being written. So, writing, in the known history of human languages of 70,000 years, writing is hardly 5,000 years, and in our country, it's only 2,000 years old.
Right, very
Therefore,
true.
written language is the smallest part of the linguistic stock of in human history. That's a historical, unchallengeable fact.
Linguistic diversity is threatened around the world for many different reasons. Would you say in India there are other sort of more culturally specific or India related factors at play here, or is it the same pressures of globalization, etc.?
There are two ways of looking at it. You of course know Manto's story of a fellow on the border of Pakistan and India, not knowing where he belongs to Pakistan or to India.
Right.
So that was saying, yeah.
Where languages meet, either in temporal scale or in geographical locations. When a language vanishes and develops into something else, the people in between don't know whether they belong to this or that. It's the same with go to Nipani and Belgaum. They don't know whether they're speaking Kannada or Marathi. But language is brought on the dissection table in a classroom. It is necessary to decide that there is one body of language as against another body of language. But in real life, a lot more times, people live in many languages or a language and its dialects or many dialects at the same time. And the human brain allows that quite comfortably. For the census purpose, it is for the grammarian's purpose, it is for a scientist's purpose, that languages have to be named as distinctly as animal bodies are named. And unfortunately, in the process, during the evolution of this science, the earliest metaphors for describing language were taken from botany and zoology. Whereas language is not a life system, it is a cultural system, it's a social system of tokens. And languages do not take birth like buffaloes do and die like buffaloes or tigers or birds die.
Having said that, Anvita Abbi, you actually worked with languages speakers who were the so-called last speakers of their languages. In the Andamans, Boa language, Licho, who spoke the Sare language. In some ways, was that like witnessing a death?
Yes, but before I go ahead, Sandip, let me correct you. The language name is not Boa. The language name is Bo.
The speaker was
the speaker was Boa. Boa means earth, dharti. So she was known as Boa. And yes, it is like, I can't tell you my feeling. It's very sad and very depressing to work on a language where you realize there's only one speaker left and he had or she had no one to communicate with. So the kind of anxiety and anguishness and the sadness that person goes through, knowing very well that once she dies, then the language will cease to exist. I feel like I'm sitting in an emergency room in a hospital, and that there is no infrastructure in this hospital. And I see the patient on the stretcher, and I want to help, but I'm helpless. What can I do? You see, at the best, I can learn a little bit of that language so that I can speak with that person. And that sort of revives that person. And I've seen that, Boa Senior coming to life because I used to every year, and I spent a lot of time with her, that she used to hold my hand and wouldn't let me go. She says, no, madam, आप इधर ही रहिए. आप जाता है तो सब लोग अंडमानी हिंदी में बात करता है. आप रहता है तो सब अंडमानी में बात करता है. This was her Andamani Hindi. So if you leave, then everybody will speak in Andamanese Hindi. If you stay, people will at least use their language. So you keep staying with us. This is what she used to request. And I was with her almost till the last hour because she was in the hospital. And in the hospital, her caretakers informed her that they used to call me madam. So that madam is there. And so she said, ask madam to talk to the doctor. And I said, listen, my talking to the doctor would not help. And after a couple of hours, I heard that she was no more.
I saw an art installation at the Indian Museum very recently, which was about her and the fact that when she had nobody to speak to, she would speak to the birds.
Yeah, I informed that because that's what we caught her with once talking to birds. And she said, don't you know they were our ancestors? That's why I talked to her. And then came out a story of creation myth, how Great Andamanese became birds. And that, in fact, that story became very popular because National Book Trust published it. And I also included in my last book called Voices from the Lost Horizon. And many environmentalists have put it on their blog because that's why you see Great Andamanese are hunters and gatherers, but they don't kill birds. They don't eat birds other than chicken, which is a very recent phenomenon. It's a homegrown thing, But they don't kill birds because they think they were the ancestors.
Now, one thing, and I'm going to come back to you, Anvita, about this as well. But let me ask Ganesh, Devy first. When you and the volunteers were doing this survey of languages, alongside people's attachment to the language, which Anvita was just talking about in terms of this woman in the Andamans, are we also somewhat being taught to be ashamed of our languages, or thinking our particular language is primitive?
No language is seen by the speakers of that language as inadequate language or awkward language or language to be ashamed of. In fact, language is an essential human right. If we have freedom of expression, we need a means of expression. Language is the most universal, easiest means of expression. So there is no sense of shame, but there is a lot of sense of anger among people because their languages are being wiped out from official records. On ground, they might be alive, but in official records, they're wiped out. I mean, take a mail in the last census, something like 1389 mother tongue names were accepted by the census. But in the final round, they are categorized as 121 languages. So people feel angry. I mean, if Bhojpuri people speak, they are not ashamed of speaking Bhojpuri in the context of Bhojpuri language sphere. But if their language is put as a subset of Hindi, they are angry about this awkwardness about, like Pygmalion of Shaw. I mean, somebody speaking a dialect as against a standard language. It is a statement of power. And people don't feel ashamed, but they resent the imposition of power by use of language. And invariably in human history, it is the languages of the periphery, what Latin used to describe as the vernaculars. They continued their existence and became stronger. Latin declined. Sanskrit declined, and the bhashas like Oriya, Bangla, Punjabi, Marathi, Gujarati, they started growing and became stronger. So any language of imposition becomes weaker in the course of history. And those languages on whom such a language is imposed, they grow stronger. Because languages grow by accepting, not by rejecting. And any idea of language purity is the first warning of its subsequent death.
So, by that logic, would you say Hindi would face the same fate as Sanskrit, or is it growing by basically taking other things like Bhojpuri and putting it under its umbrella? Because I've also read another report which said that in fact the fastest growing Indian language today is actually Bhojpuri.
No, about Hindi, Anvita mentioned, and I will repeat what she said. It is a recent language, and it still has to run its full course. The government is trying to show that 52 crores were speaking Hindi as against on the base of 121 crores counted that in that census of 2011. But people are saying that it's only 38 crores because other 14 crores are claiming Bhojpuri, Pauri, Kumauni, Gadwali and other languages as their languages. The fact is there is a big gap between government's perception of language and people's perception of language. Even when there were no empires, no state structure, language was there, and language will remain a complex language that we have, and for which the brain structure is made competent. That alone distinguishes us from other animal species. So long as Homo sapiens survives, language of one or the other kind will survive. The states don't either allow languages to grow or they are not able to kill a language. It is people who keep it alive or desert it and move on to another language.
Ganesh, I would like to inform you that when you said that no language speaker is ashamed to speak their language, it's not very correct, because when we work on tribal areas, I realize, especially in Jharkhand, I realize Kuduk, I've seen Kuduk mothers thrashing the children because they were speaking Kuduk. And this all happens because of our attitude towards those languages. So some speakers of some minority languages develop inferiority complex. And because of inferiority complex, they don't want their children to learn their language. I have seen mass harakiri, really. Literally, I have interviewed many young kids and I have seen this, and this was in mid 80s, early 90s also. People are happy to forget their language. They don't want to mention it. They said, don't mention, we are Hindi speakers, because that's what the honor is in. In fact, if you remember, before Punjabi Suba was made in 62, I think, all the Punjabis claimed to be mother tongue of Hindi. And then when the Punjabi Suba was made, there was a total change in language loyalty and they all became Punjabi speakers. So language loyalty is a very shifting kind of a phenomena. It goes with what the trend is. So I have seen many people are at least not identifying with their language because they think it's a lower status thing. Inside home also, they say, speak in Hindi, that's what you will be good at. And when I objected, they said, Madam, Hindi nahi bolega to aapke jaise kaise banega? If he doesn't speak Hindi, how would he be like you?
Which is a very valid point, and I don't know, how does one answer this? Because in some ways, what they're saying is that it's all very well to take pride in the folklore and creation stories in my language, but in the end, the world will require this person to, maybe they will go for a job in Delhi or something.
Yeah, Sandip, there's no contradiction. You see, when a child comes to school, he's already a multilingual. In Jharkhand alone, I saw a child is very good in Sadri, Kuduk, Khadiya, and Santhali, and Hindi is an imposition. In Chhattisgarhi, I have seen the children speaking Chhattisgarhi, the community Chhattisgarhi, and the home Chhattisgarhi, which is little different variety. They learn Hindi in school just like we learn English in school. It's a foreign language for them. But yes, it can be taught. But by and by, not immediately. In fact, the first 5 years of the children in the new education policy also, which is grouped as, 5, 3, 3, 4 batch. So in the first 5 years, the first 3 years are Anganwadi. In the Anganwadi stage, the child should be taught and learning everything in what you call the community language or the home language. And, and no Hindi or English should be introduced till the grade 3 maybe, or maybe 4. And in fact, if you remember, the NEP starts with first sentences that we ensure that the children stay in the school, and, they are saying there's no dropout rate. But, there's a very high dropout rate from school in the areas of tribal communities and other communities, primarily because we are not teaching them in their language. The teachers are drawn from the community. The children are also drawn from the same community, yet they don't converse in that community language. So that's the irony.
And in fact, when you talk about the last speakers of this language, they were not necessarily the last members of that tribe. That means there were other people in their tribe or family who no longer spoke that language or were not interested in it, right?
No, unfortunately, this Great Andamanese is a very interesting example. These were the last member of the community also. Because if you remember the history of Strait Island or the post-independent India, when the government of India saw that these were scattered all over the North Andaman, what they did, they collected the members from various different tiny islands and put them in Strait Island, thinking we'll save the community and save the language. Well, this was done on the recommendation of T.N. Pandit, the famous anthropologist. I'm happy it was done because otherwise everything would have been lost. Yes, so they developed a mixed language, which I call PGA, Present Great Andamanese. So I wrote the grammar and the dictionary of PGA. But these members brought their own lexicon, vocabulary items from their individual languages. So that's why it is mixed and that's why it is very enriching. And there are some words which are totally unheard of. I've talked about it earlier, like word like Ropuch, which none of languages has it because it means the person who has lost his sibling. And we don't have a word for a person who loses his or her sibling. We have a word for vidwa, the person who loses her husband. We have a word for person who loses his wife. We have a word for person who loses their parents, like anath and orphans. But we don't have a word if you lose your brother or sister. See? So this language has. And that was very interesting to me. And that's what unique worldview they had. And they also shows how intimate connection they had with their family members. I agree with Professor Devy when he's talking about Sanskrit and why it had an oral tradition of several hundreds of years. If you remember when when the Aryans came, they brought their language Sanskrit with them. And of course, they didn't bring their wives with them. Male members came. So who did they marry? They married the Austro-Asiatic communities and other local women, you see. So Sanskrit was never a mother tongue ever. It remained a father tongue and then it remained a language of elites and Brahmin class till today. But at the most, Sanskrit was a father tongue, and the languages that you see, modern Indo-Aryan languages, have developed from Prakrit. We have a lot of influence of Sanskrit, no doubt, but the real languages are come out because of the intermingling of communities. See, so there are several Prakrits.
We actually discussed some of this when we had Peggy Mohan on the show as well some time back. But on another angle, Ganesh Devi, I was wondering, when you talk about the evolution of languages and how languages crisscross, what do you think is going to be the impact of the growth of social media on language? Because so many people I know seem to communicate, for example, through images now, rather than less than words.
Yeah, when languages were oral, entirely oral, they had life of one kind. When the writing entered human societies, the nature of languages change. A certain kind of idea of standard emerge. When printing came into human society, the nature of languages changed. Languages became easier to store for passing on to next generations. So when the digits have entered in our life and a virtual space has come in, obviously language which is actually carried through airwaves, air is the medium, sound is the medium, that is going to change quite fundamentally and radically. There are some researches which show that the Broca's lobe is functioning a little less competently than before in the human brain, and the visual grasp of the world is acquiring a greater focus and sharpness. It is possible that words made of sound might slowly slip into meaning tokens made out of visual symbols. But if that happens, it still remains a language, because language is a system of symbols. At the moment, it is sound symbols, phonetic symbols. They might become visual symbols. I think going by all the past experience, when a new medium comes, old mediums acquire a new dynamic, but all of them continue to stay. It becomes another accretion, another layer of language use. The social media is impacting human memory in a very big way. And there is, rather than language loss, there is a greater danger of memory loss. And memory is one of the essential foundations of language as a system. And that's where languages will take a beating in terms of shortened memory, which also means a clumsier use of the past tense in many languages. Like many varieties of the past tense seem to be less in use. Metaphors people no longer understand. Double meanings of words are lost. Imaginative expression. I mean, in most of our languages, we used to have hundreds of proverbs and sayings and various ways of expressing meanings. Those other layers of meaning are getting kind of eroded very rapidly due to the use of social media and compacting of human memory and expansion of artificial memory.
And I would love to get both your views on, the current sort of controversy going around, where there is so much attention on Hindi, right? When somebody about this whole third language business, where you talk about the imposition of Hindi, whether a Tamil speaker or a Bengali speaker says that. But how much are we aware of how much these languages, whether it's Bengali or Tamil, impose in their own backyard?
As far as imposition of Bangla on the marginal languages in Bengal or of imposition of Marathi in marginal languages in Maharashtra, it is exactly the same as imposition of Hindi on areas surrounding the Hindi-speaking people. That is a question relating to our federal structure and power statements that we make rather than a linguist oppose that imposition. I have done it all through my life, but it is not a question in the area of language study or linguistics as such.
I think, Sandeep, as far as I'm concerned, I think my answer is already there. And when I gave you the example of the Hindi belt Chhattisgarh and the Hindi belt area of Jharkhand, where Hindi is imposed in school and children were not able to understand what was going on in the class. So any kind of imposition is bad. And as I have always propagated all my life, since the multilingualism is, let's say, in the DNA of Indian community. Even in Indus Valley civilization and beyond, we were always multilingual. And I'm sure the day the IVC, the Indus Valley civilization script will be deciphered, people will see some Austroasiatic features in it, you see, or they may see some Dravidian features in it. And as I told you that when a child comes to school, a class, he's already multilingual, bilingual. We should exploit that. And rather than imposing a language, the already knowledge that the child has about languages should be implemented in the class and taught. And by very gradually, these state languages, whether it's Tamil or Bangla or Marathi or English, should be introduced. So by the time the child moves out of school, he would have a good knowledge of some of his community languages and the state language and English. Because without English, I just don't think there's any community which hates English. And as you know, I'm basically a field linguist who work from village to village and forest to forest. And I have seen they worship Angrezi Devi. The first temple of Angrezi Devi came out in 2010 in Banka village of Uttar Pradesh. And if you see the idol of Angrezi Devi, she's standing on a computer. She has a constitution in one hand. And there's a similar Angrezi Devi temple I saw in Jharkhand, in Ranchi. And, tribals just want to learn English. We are also talking right now in English. So these languages have to be taught. But this is the problem that we think multilingual education is a static phenomenon. It should be dynamic and it should be applied to each state and region differently according to their needs and their makeup of the linguistic diversity. The problem with, so far, the government of India's education policy has been that same policies applies to the entire country. And they think only that there is a division between North and South and no other divisions. How about Northeast? Why they should learn the kind of languages we make a kind of a mandatory languages for the North and South? They already have accepted, contact Hindi. There's an Arunachali Hindi, there is a Meghalaya Hindi. That Hindi they understand and they would like to converse in. But the standard Hindi that is taught in school, which is highly Sanskritized, even the Hindi belt people don't understand.
I agree with Anvita. Language question in primary school education belong to the joint list. It is actually wrong on the part of the federal government, central government to take it over. The best method would be to allow the district officer to decide what should be the language policy for that district. India is a linguistic civilization. It has always been so. That civilization has multilingualism, as Anvita said, in its DNA, and that we must respect. If we are at all talking in terms of our heritage and all that, otherwise those are empty words. And this multilingual heritage of our civilization also has sad history of imposition, because civilization, the British came here in the name of civilizing us and imposed a language on us. Civilization involves a certain amount of tyranny of the powerful over the powerless. And therefore, it should be left to the district officer to decide what should be the languages of school for that district. I think that would be very practical.
The People's Linguistic Survey of India was done around 2010-11, so about 15 years ago. And it was to in some ways, to gauge the state of India's languages and linguistic diversity. 15 years later, what would you say is the state of India's language and linguistic diversity right now?
See, that was a collective effort to raise the voice of the people on language issue. And I'm glad it was done. And it is necessary to raise that kind of voice collectively, time and again. And I think the time has come now for people of India to rise and say that to decide on language is our prerogative, and the state better take a back seat there. The answer to your question is not repeat the same exercise again and again. It will be futile. It will be huge waste of human energy, because this took a lot of human energy, human time. But raising the voice of the people is important, particularly on the language issue, because so far that is the only domain which people possess and own rather than the state possessing it. The day it goes under the complete control of the state, that will be the last day in the democracy of any country.
Well, number one, I would like to appraise your listeners that what Professor Ganesh Devy did about launching PLSI was something amazing, very commendable and outlandish. Nobody ever thought that this can be achieved. And the way he reached out to common people at various places, and as he said, this was People's Linguistic Survey. So for the first time, we got to know what India is thinking, you see. So it cannot be undermined. And you see, there are always criticism. There's always ways for improvement of any project. So of course, I'm sure if Ganesh Devy has to do it again after 5 years or now, he may have changed his methodology or something. But that's question apart. Hats off to him for doing this job and to apprising us of the new information. I just want to close it down by saying that no matter what we do, we must maintain our linguistic diversity and plurilinguality, both. Because of that, we have existed and we have survived for thousands of years. And our culture, our tradition, our oral tradition specifically, is very rich. Our indigenous knowledge should be documented. Documentation is a very important aspect of discipline that one has to undertake. And there should be reverse education, which I don't see. That is, whatever there is in these oral languages should be taught to us, to our children.
Can you leave us with one story that you learned when you collected these stories from the last speakers that you think we all need to hear?
Well, I think I've already talked about it, about the disaster management, how they save themselves from it, which is a very big issue. But I also did a lot of work on the names of the Great Andamanese birds and the ornithological information that the Great Andamanese had is amazing, and it should be recorded. I mean, we have done a book published by Oxford University Press, and this should be made a textbook in ornithological departments, that yes, these are same, so many different kinds of birds, because it also describes the bird's habit, their flying techniques and their height of flight and all kinds of things, how many eggs it lays, the other interesting information of indigenous kind also. So these are my last words, that way reverse education can be brought in from many, many areas of life.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Anvita Abbi and Ganesh Devy, and thank you for all your work.
Thank you. Thank you, Anvita. It's a joy.
Thanks, Ganesh. Thank you.
Ganesh Devy is a cultural activist and literary critic. He started the Bhasha Research and Publication Center in Vadodara and was the moving spirit behind the People's Linguistic Survey of India, which was conducted in 2010. Anvita Abbi is a linguist and scholar of minority and tribal languages, best known for her work on the languages and culture of the Great Andamanese, and the author of the book Voices from the Lost Horizon, Songs and Stories of the Great Andamanese. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts in any language of your choice. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargav and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.